Your rights are my responsibility. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. And I'm not listening to your stupid classes.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Bill Roach. This is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, and today I want to speak to you, many of you who are in this audience who listen to this channel, about why you should be paying attention to the Jordan Peterson case in Canada. And I think one of the reasons it's important for all of you is that of all the people I know, you're informed on the issues of free speech and liberty. And what we're finding is that this case in the Western world is a clear example of what happens when totalitarian regimes come in and completely remove your individual rights and liberties for their progressive agenda or whatever agenda these figures have in mind. Now, what I want us to do is I want us to think very briefly. You know, we did a conference several months ago, and one figure that I spoke with was a woman named Chi Van Fleet, and she has recently published a book on Mao's America. And the point of the book that she talks about is the role of struggle sessions and forced re-education, and the total collapse of individual liberties in light of totalitarianism and this authoritarianism that's just rampant throughout China. And what she continues to look at is that so many people here in the West don't see the fact that we're falling for the exact same games. You know, it's really interesting because if you see the class warfare that took place in Russia, the main difference between it and China was the fact that they gave us the exact same type of regime, just with Chinese flavor to it. And we're finding that exact Russian theme and Chinese flavor given to us in the United States. But the difference is this, is that yes, there's a class warfare that's going on. And yes, it's meeting our particular sort of nuances of the American West and really Western society. But what we're also finding is that they're using the same tactics as Mao. They're using the struggle session approach and really these kangaroo courts, we could say, in order to give a managerial class authority over you to the total neglect of your individual rights and liberties. And that's why this is so important, is that what you have to see is that when you're looking at this Jordan Peterson case, yes, the Supreme Court made their verdict on the matter, but what started the whole issue was not that Peterson did something wrong clinically. It's not that he did something wrong professionally. It's not like he did something wrong in a pure public sense. They are going after him for tweets that he put out speaking against Trudeau, speaking out against the woke mob, speaking out against the proper speech that's been given to them. And we see this warfare that's going back and forth, this dialectical regime that's working itself out for the total control of society and the silencing of those who oppose them. So why should you be paying attention to this? Let me just tell you this. If they can do it to Peterson with his platform and all the things that he has going for them, there's nothing to say that they cannot do the exact same thing to you. And never forget that. So as we look at this, what I want us to see here is this clear idea of how this applies to the individual citizen. So let's pull up his Twitter here that kind of discusses this to a very basic degree. So he's laying out this whole issue, and he says, I want the entire current crop of minions at the College of Psychologists to publicly apologize and then resign en masse. They want me to undergo re-education, which they know will take up my time and fail in any case. And this is going to be important that you're going to see later, because he knows that it's going to fail. But in an article that we're going to look at here in just a second, they're going to talk about how long this re-education camp can go on for. Namely, they want it to succeed. They want him to bend the knee. But it goes on to say this, so they can undermine my reputation and take my license away. Anyway, lay down your bets. But then he goes on to say this, and I think this is what's interesting. He says, a higher court in Canada has ruled that the Ontario College of Psychologists indeed has the right to sentence me to re-education camp. There are no other legal avenues open to me now. So the next thing that I want you to just keep on your back burner here real quick is that this is a managerial class. This is a college of psychologists. It's not the legal field. It's not the court in and of itself that are calling him to do this. Rather, it's a committee that's starting to do this. And he goes on to say, it's capitulate to the petty bureaucrats and the addle-padded woke mob or lose my professional license. Now, I will say this. That's a difficult line to read out loud to somebody. That is a perfect way to encapture what's going on here. It's a woke mob of people. But I also want us to be reminded of this. Where do we see these long, drawn out, bend your knee at no other cost type of actions? Well, Chi Van Fleet reminded us of this. This is exactly what Mao did in China. Now, what's interesting is that Mao not only did it to you, he would do it to your family. He would do it to your broader extended family. He would widen it as far as possible in order to keep the struggle session as strong as possible upon an individual. And at this point, they're solely going after Peterson, but not for long. Now, what I want to do here is I want to transition to one other article here that's going to help us understand what's going on. Now, I know that I got to readjust this briefly, so stick with me. This is one of those things in OBS that we are still trying to work out with people, but still it's one of the best platforms for us here. See how quick that happens, how much we can go here. So it says this, Jordan Peterson, bureaucrats will rue the day they tried to shut me up. And that's one of the things Peterson also talks about. They may have won the war, but the battle is completely not over. They won that battle, but the war is going to continue. But notice this. The petty tyrants at the College of Psychologists of Ontario have no right to force me into re-education. And what I want us to do is I want us to consider a few of the key points from this article. And of course, we got to have these lovely article advertisements here. It says this, in November 2022, just to get the background on this, the administrative board that regulates the conduct of psychologists, and much more than that, it turns out, decided that my political views were a disgrace to my profession, that of clinical psychologist. I was therefore sentenced by that board, the Ontario College of Psychologists, to a bout of mandatory re-education of indeterminate duration at my expense, with my learning not evaluated by any standard method, but subject to the opinion of those charged with profiting by and exploiting my forced studentship. In other words, it can go on until they say that it must stop. You must participate in this re-education struggle session at your own dime, by your own cost. You're fitting the bill here. Notice this, until he bends the knee. And notice, he's giving us this clear explanation of why this is so important. It's because these figures here are not using any standard legal measure or any really standard scientific measure on when a person has been re-educated. Notice what he's saying here. It's that when they are personally decided, or they've come up with their subjective opinion about when he's actually bent the knee enough. And he goes on to say this, I took those decision makers forthwith to court and lost. The decision of the Ontario College of Psychologists was upheld. I then appealed to a higher court on January 16th, 2024. The appeal was rejected. There were no reasons provided. Now it goes on to say this, and I think that he's right here, says, this means that my legal options have been exhausted. Thus I face two choices. I can comply when the college goes ahead with its determination to require my re-education, dutifully attend whatever bloody classes their DEI enthusiasts, namely social media experts, whatever those are, determined to inflict upon, confess the sins of my classic liberal, conservative, or even Judeo-Christian political, philosophical, and theological commitments, repent and silence myself, or even become a standard bearer for the Fox compassionate woke mob, at least publicly. Alternatively, I can tell my would-be masters to go directly to the hell they are so rapidly gathering around themselves, and everyone else lose my right to practice or even describe myself as a psychologist and suffer the consequences of the reputation front. Notice what's going on here in so many respects. What you're seeing here is that as we see exactly how Mao's China worked out, is that they wanted to make you an enemy of the people. They wanted to smear you as an individual who shouldn't be allowed to function properly within society. And that's precisely what's going on here. And that's why we start this whole issue with this background of Mao's effects on the West. And what we have to find is that we live in a world of laws, and that laws definitely should matter only if they're enforced, only if the standard is the law in and of itself. Now, we also live in a world of chaos when we completely and utterly disregard the rule of law and given rights that are established in light of these legal sort of proceedings that we've seen take place. And this is exactly what we're finding here is that Canada historically has been a nation of laws, but they're also a nation of chaos right now because they're completely undoing any recollection of their historic past and the bearings that's been given to them. And notice that Peterson is talking about the classical liberal background, the Judeo-Christian background, the whole Western legal trajectory that's just being totally thrown asunder here. Notice this, these rights are being taken away not just by courts, but by an administrative board or regulators who arbitrarily decide if you're in compliance. If they find you out of compliance, then you'll be forced to go through re-education at your own dime or face disciplinary action. Notice this, they are playing a sleight of hand by claiming you're not facing discipline. Because notice that they're going to say this, we're not actually disciplining you. We're just simply saying you need a few things fixed. We're saying you need to be re-educated. Rather, what they're saying is if you don't go along, then you're going to face discipline. Notice this ridiculous word game that's taking place here. Re-education in all of these totalitarian regimes is discipline for not falling for all of the trickery and the antics of the regimes. And here's why you need to pay attention to this. You very well could be the next target. Think about it. Jordan Peterson has one of the largest platforms. He has one of the best reputations on that platform and really abroad and beyond his particular platforms and within his profession. So if they can do it to him, if they can do it to the greater, why can they not do it to you, the lesser? Now, I'm not trying to devalue you in any respect as an individual. What I'm wanting to realize is that most people on this planet don't have the exact same platform as Jordan Peterson. And if they can get away with it in such a public way, why can't they do it in your legal profession or your education profession or in your health profession or any other type of profession just because you don't go along with what's being put forward? But what I also want you to see is this, and I think this is of key importance here. The judicial difference, he says, has granted control to a professional managerial class. Notice, these are people who are appointed usually by people that have been trained in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity meaning critical consciousness, inclusion meaning we're only going to include those with critical consciousness, and equity ultimately is Marxism, socialism, and due punishment upon those who don't buy into all three categories of it. And he goes on to say this, but the divisional court deferred to the college, body created by provincial legislation, concluding that the order was a reasonable exercise of the regulator's authority. In the era of judicial difference or deference to the administrative state, constitutional rights do not mean what many Canadians think they mean. So notice, you are living in a time right now that he's talking about where you have this board, this group that's been given to us, who are not following the law of the land, but they're following what they deem to be a reasonable exercise. Did you hear that? Reasonable according to whom? Well, reasonable according to those who have been trained, fully sort of infected with, fully bought into the virus of diversity, inclusion, and the woke mob. This is precisely what we're finding here. Now, notice what he goes on to say. He says, in most circumstances, regulatory bodies are not required to apply the law correctly. Listen to this. The Supreme Court has said, but only reasonably. In other words, in certain contexts, a regulator can be legally wrong if it's not unreasonably wrong. In other words, you can totally undermine any understanding of the law insofar as you can convince a group of people that this board is acting reasonably. But when we look at all of the things that have taken place over the last several decades, so much of it is completely, utterly chaotic, and there's nothing reasonable about it. And just like you see things coming about with, reasonable according to the World Economic Forum, or reasonable according to HR departments completely, utterly steeped in DEI ideology, the reasonable here is not according to the classic understandings of logic or the canons of what is valid and sound classical reasoning in this regard. Rather, it's reasonable according to the DEI standards that have been laid down by the West. Now, notice what he goes on to say here. And I know we're not pulling this up. I'm just kind of giving you a couple highlights here. It says, in cases involving the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, regulatory bodies can infringe charter rights if they do so proportionately. He goes on to say, where a court is reviewing a decision that may infringe a charter right, as in the Peterson case, regulators are entitled to deference if the decision falls within a range of possible acceptable outcomes. They can take your rights away from you, as long as a group of people say that it is reasonable. And that should scare the ever-living hell out of you. Think about it. A group of people in a closed-door meeting who can come out with their reasonable explanations, can literally do whatever they want to you, and the freedoms given to you by your chartered documents, namely the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada at this point, mean nothing. They can infringe upon them. Or in other words, as he said earlier, that they're not required to apply the law correctly. You see the dire consequences of that? It means the law is utterly worthless. So why should you pay attention to this? Because it's coming for individuals just like you and just like me, who are not buying into this ideology, who are not going along with these sessions, and can so easily be manipulated by them and lose all of our bloody rights in the midst of it. Now let's continue looking at this. He goes on to say in this article here, he says, and it is even worse than that. The court has enabled regulatory bodies to ignore charter rights altogether if they instead balance imaginary charter values, mentioned nowhere in the text, by which they mean progressive ideals such as equity, social justice, and group dignity. So the point that you're looking at here is that they're taking rights away and now they're being replaced with values. And isn't that just such a mantra of things in the West? You don't have ethics anymore. You have values. So you have one person who values this particular stance on something and another person with an opposing view values their particular stance on the matter. But notice that there's no objective criterion to say this one is right and that one is wrong. There's simply a difference of what do you value. And given the fact that in the postmodern West, given the fact of the totalitarian West, or at least that's what is starting to encroach upon the West, these values are going to be whoever is right is whoever is in power. That's the power play, is that if everything is a power play, then whoever's in the political power has the right to say whose values get represented in the public sphere. And what this becomes ultimately is the death of individual liberty. It's the death of religious freedom. It's the death of the freedom of speech all throughout the West. No ifs, ands, or buts. You can only have the values, the charter values that we say that you can have. And we all know what they're going to have to match up against: diversity, equity, and inclusion. It goes on to say this, but the legal ground has slowly shifted beneath our feet. We have moved away from the rule of law back towards rule of executive fiat. Judicial deference grants control not to a monarch, but to a professional managerial class. Broad discretion in the hands of administrative bodies has become the foundation of our modern system of government. Notice this. These administrative bodies, many of which are not even elected, sort of like in the American system, all these federal bureaucrats that are out there that have all this control over you, whether it be the environment or how far you can drive or what you can put up in your front lawn, all these different things. These are the people that are ruling over you. Notice they're replacing the tyranny of the king for the tyranny of the professional managerial class. He goes on to say, deference from the courts makes regulatory witch hunts possible. Why? Because you don't have any legal basis to defend your rights in these situations. He goes on to say, when carefully crafted in the guise of unprofessional conduct, civility, or undermining public trust in the profession. Goes on to say this, professional regulators can turn their focus from ensuring competence and ethical practice to political compliance. And that's precisely what's going on here. It says in Peterson's case, complaints did not come from clients nor relate to his psychology practice, which he ceased in 2017. Instead, they largely targeted Peterson's tweets on political topics such as Justin Trudeau and his chief of staff and Ottawa city councillor, the climate change agenda, and transgender activism. A few other points. Under the college's order, Peterson must pay for the remediation himself. So not only are we going to force you to go through re-education, we're going to force you to pay for the re-education. The sessions will end when the coach determines that Peterson is appropriately re-educated. Yet the college insists that the order is not disciplinary. Notice the play of words going on here. You notice the total cup game that's taking place here, of which any rational thought, any legal right, any bearing that this has on any traditional Western value is being completely swept under the rug. He goes on to say this. In fact, the college's committee did not conduct a disciplinary hearing and never concluded that Peterson committed professional misconduct. Nevertheless, the college has promised that failing to complete the program may result in an allegation of professional misconduct and the commencement of actual disciplinary proceedings. In short, the Law Society of Ontario proposes to give its Proceedings Authorization Committee similar powers to require lawyers to submit to re-education, even if the committee concludes that there were no grounds for a disciplinary hearing. Across the country, regulators are becoming ever more insistent on ideological concurrence. So, like I said, this is of grave importance for you. This type of action happening anywhere in the West should scare the hell out of you. And the reason it should scare the hell out of you is because this is the complete degradation of your fundamental freedoms and your fundamental rights, your ability to provide for yourself, provide for your family. And you know what? They're going to let you pay for it in and of yourself at your own dime. And when they think you've gone through enough, well, then we may one day let you go. But don't you ever speak up again. Like I said, this is the Maoification of the West. We need to see this for what it is. We need to understand this for what it is. Namely, it's totalitarian woke witch hunts, and we shouldn't fall for it. So why should you pay attention to this? Because if they can do it to Peterson, they can do it to you.
A man has to decide that he's going to do something. And I'm not listening to your stupid classes. Your rights are my responsibility.